So thank you, Dan, for the introduction, and thank you to the Gay Men's Sexual Health Alliance and Community-Based Research Center for Gay Men's Health for hosting this two-part webinar series. I'm going to start off by following up on a couple of questions that were posed during the last webinar, because it often takes me a little time to think of an answer to questions. And then I'm going to do a brief 5-minute overview of the previous webinar and then delve into today's topic, which is loneliness, specifically among GBTQ men. So one person asked about the possible role socialization may play in loneliness, particularly with respect to gender differences and how men and women interact. And I just wanted to unpack that a little bit. First, we often assume there are gender differences in loneliness, and I don't think I mentioned in the last webinar, but the gender differences are actually quite small. And second, it is true that men and women tend to interact differently on average. Women's interactions are characterized more by talking, especially talking about feelings, whereas men's are a little more instrumental. They interact with each other by doing things rather than solely talking. I don't think that we can assume that one style of interaction is better than the other. Both can certainly create strong social bonds between people. We often assume that when men are together, all they do is sort of, drink beer and burp and scratch themselves, but they do bond, they do talk about things, they talk about feelings, just perhaps in a less direct way. This may be due to socialization. Personally, I think it's probably due to evolution and biology, but that's a debate for another time. In any case, to the extent that men and women prefer interacting in a particular way, and it seems to me that they do, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and that one style leads to loneliness. For men who don't like interacting in an instrumental way, who want more time and space to talk about feelings, there are certainly venues for that, such as men's discussion groups and support groups. Unfortunately, given the political climate we're in, sometimes these groups have been derided as a bit misogynist, and people have had difficulty getting them off the ground. Where there is a gender difference that I think can be problematic is the fact that men are less likely than women to actually follow up on and maintain their relationships. So I think they need to be encouraged to do that more often. Somebody also asked, how do you initially engage lonely people who may be wary of social contact, given how loneliness can lead to excessive withdrawal and aversive social interactions? To reiterate, I wanted to say it's important to educate people about the cycle of chronic maladaptive loneliness. This may help them see how their current perceptions and behaviors are counterproductive, and that there may be more effective ways of relating to people. In group settings, it'd be quite helpful to start with non-social activities and then move into more direct social interaction. And when starting a group that's focused on loneliness in particular, it's probably better to focus on general information rather than sort of forcing people to interact right off the bat. Also important not to personalize the issue too much and make anybody feel like they're being singled out. And over several sessions, people are probably likely to get used to one another and then may slowly open up about their own experiences and hopefully build relationships over time. And finally, somebody asked what my ideal loneliness program would be. I want to reiterate again that there's no ideal intervention. It all depends on each person's specific case, including the type of loneliness that they're experiencing, emotional versus social, or transient versus chronic, what may have caused it, whether their social cognition has become distorted, what their personality traits are, what their cognitive style are, what their interests are, and also just what their motivation is to change. Because I think that the better question is, rather than asking what the ideal program is, I think it's better to ask what are the ideal components for different types of interventions, each of which may be more or less appropriate for different groups of people. So, having said a mouthful there, brief overview of last month's webinar. Social isolation and loneliness tend to be confused frequently. Isolation is an objective situation, having a small social network or minimal contact with people in that social network, and we measure that objectively by counting how many people one has in their social network, for example. Loneliness is subjective. It is perceived social isolation, and very specifically, it's a mismatch between the relationships you have and the relationships you actually want in terms of the number and especially the perceived quality of those relationships. It tends to elicit very strong emotional pain, and it evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to promote survival and reproduction and serves a purpose, like hunger, thirst, and physical pain to tell us when our needs are not being met, and it prompts us to take corrective action. It also tends to be quite highly stigmatized. We see loneliness. When we hear that someone's lonely, we think that they are somehow a social failure, that there's something fundamentally wrong with them. And importantly, there's only a loose association between isolation and loneliness. So you can have a small social network and not feel lonely if you're happy with the people in your network and you're getting your needs met. And conversely, you can have a huge social network and feel very lonely if you're not happy with the people in your network and the quality of those relationships. And that may be due to the fact that people just have individual differences in perceptions of relationships and individual needs for social contact. It's also distinct from solitude. Solitude is pleasurable time spent alone. It's not a bad thing. There's many benefits to solitude. Loneliness is unwanted solitude, and I think sometimes we romanticize loneliness, and I think that's because we sort of confuse it with solitude. Importantly, I think people need an optimal mix of social interaction and time spent alone. Unfortunately, there tends to be right now a lot of focus on making sure that people are interacting with others all the time, and there's a strong push to get people to be partnered and to be in relationships. And there can be quite a lot of discrimination against people who are not in relationships, and we feel that there's something wrong with them if they're not in a relationship. And it's a really interesting book by Bella DiPaolo, who writes about the discrimination that singles, people who want to be single, the discrimination they experience from people who are coupled. And she came up with a term for this called singleism. And of course, not to be outdone, there was also a book about a gay singleism that was written a couple of years after that book. It's quite an interesting read. Loneliness related to depression. Certainly loneliness can be a symptom of depression, but more often loneliness is a result of depression. Rejection and social exclusion are very strong risk factors for being lonely, but you can be quite accepted by everybody around you, but you may just feel that you're not accepted, and so therefore be at increased risk for loneliness. It's also not the same thing as the absence of social support. You can have a lot of social support in your life, but still feel quite lonely if the social support is intrusive, if it comes from people who are overbearing, if it's from people you don't like, if it's not reciprocal, or if it comes with strings attached. And importantly, there's different kinds of loneliness. As we remember, intimate emotional loneliness is the perceived absence of a close attachment figure, like a partner, a spouse, or best friend. Social loneliness is the perceived absence of a broader network of friends and family. Collective loneliness is feeling like you don't belong to a larger group of people, like a team or a political party or a religion or a country or something like that. And existential loneliness is the feeling that we all experience, that ultimately we are all alone in the world because there isn't any other person in the world who knows everything that we're thinking or feeling. These can occur by themselves or in combination. And also, as we recall, most cases of loneliness are transient and they're self-correcting. Loneliness prompts us to reconnect with people, and we usually do so successfully, but in a careful, cautious manner. In some people, for various reasons, this sort of natural, normal cycle of loneliness becomes chronic, and it's characterized by excessive social withdrawal, extremely negative social perceptions, and aversive behaviors that actually push people away rather than draw them in. People feel stuck and helpless in this cycle, and they often can't see how their own behaviors are actually reinforcing the cycle. And this could be due to prolonged isolation, personality traits, pre-existing mental health problems like social anxiety, cognitive styles, so the tendency to focus on the negative, low self-esteem, and even genetics. I mentioned last time how loneliness is associated with a whole host of health problems. I didn't mention how that might happen. And one theory is that, and for which there's quite a bit of evidence, because chronically lonely people actually feel afraid of others, they're in this constant state of fight or flight, and this leads to a wear and tear on the body over time. And we also know that loneliness has a very negative impact on sleep, and lonely people, being sort of hyper aware of their surroundings, kind of sleep with one eye open, and so they're not getting the beneficial effects of sleep, the rejuvenative effects of sleep, and so that makes the wear and tear on the body even worse. So what are some of the health consequences specifically for GBQT men? Loneliness may add to the stigma that they already experience as a result of being a sexual minority. It can also contribute to impulsivity. There's interesting research to show that when we're lonely, we become emotionally dysregulated. We also become depressed and want to improve our mood right away. And we become very oriented in the present rather than the future, as we'd expect from an evolutionary perspective, because we're in a sort of self-preservational mode. And this can lead to impulsivity, which could lead to substance misuse, misuse of social media, as I'll talk about in a few moments, perhaps unsafe sex. Loneliness also adds to the burden of GBQT aging. I'm just going to use the word gay, this doesn't roll off my tongue. Older gay men have quite a bit of, many older gay men struggle with aging, and they also experience health disparities compared to their heterosexual counterparts. The mental and physical health effects of loneliness just compound that. And although heterosexual people, when they're lonely, may be more likely to utilize healthcare services, I think gay men may be less likely to utilize healthcare services the lonelier they get, because especially if they've had a negative experience with the healthcare system in the past. And we learned also that loneliness can spread within social networks, and this may happen more quickly within the gay community because it's that much smaller, and many people know one another in the network, and aversive behavior can spread more quickly from one person to the other, therefore spreading loneliness within the network. And there's also a potential role of loneliness in syndemics, and these are mutually reinforcing interactions of disease and social conditions that occur in a particular population. So for example, loneliness and substance abuse and mental health problems and HIV likely all co-occur in the gay community, and they all reinforce one another. I talked a bit about general risk factors for loneliness last month, and we know they can be grouped into 4 broad categories. So individual factors are pre-existing health problems, various sociodemographic characteristics, advanced age. Relational factors are those pertaining to the size and quality and composition of your social network. Community factors are things like the built environment, real and perceived crime. And societal factors are all the big things like increasing longevity, geographic mobility, increasing divorce, income inequality, poor social safety nets, and all sorts of other factors which I think need much more research. So one of the factors that is receiving more attention in the literature is sexual orientation. Michael Hobbs recently wrote a really good article about loneliness in the Huffington Post, a very lengthy article, as it should be because it's quite a big topic. The article received an enormous amount of attention, so the topic obviously resonates with a lot of people. And so what I'd like to talk about is, what does the research say specifically about loneliness in this population? What is the prevalence and what are the possible causes? As a broad group, gay men do seem to have higher rates of loneliness compared to heterosexual men. When I look at my own cross-national data, I noticed that there are much bigger differences between heterosexual men and those men who have a non-exclusive sexual orientation. So heterosexual men and bisexual men versus bisexual men, or heterosexual men versus those who identify as mostly gay or mostly straight. And the biggest difference I see is between heterosexual men and those who are questioning or unsure of their sexual orientation. And in a few minutes, I'll talk about possible reasons for that. There are various sociodemographic factors which may increase risk for loneliness in this population. So GBQT men are more likely to be single and childless, to be estranged from their families of origin. And the reality is that they have a smaller pool of potential partners from which to choose. Heterosexual people have, a lot of people to choose from, gay people less so. And making matters even more difficult, from that small pool, people further narrow down their choices by looking for partners to whom they're highly attracted, with whom they have things in common, with whom they have similar relationship goals, and then not to mention compatible preferences for sexual intercourse. Older GBQT adults appear to be at increased, particularly high risk for loneliness. About a third say that they're very concerned about being lonely and growing older alone. The comparable figure is about 20% with heterosexual people. A lot of these men may have lost friends to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. They may be estranged from the church. They may feel left out by the tendency for people to use technology to meet people rather than meeting people in traditional spaces like bars. They may fear accessing healthcare, having had very bad experiences with the healthcare system in the past. And we know that even in some parts of the world, even in North America, there can be a lot of discrimination against older gay people in residential care by staff and by residents as well. Older GBQT adults also have a lower household income, and we know that's a risk factor for loneliness. It costs money to be social and to get out and to do things. And older trans people are particularly high risk for loneliness. They experience quite a lot of discrimination from society at large and also within the gay community itself. There's a wonderful documentary that most of you probably heard of, but for those who haven't, I'd encourage you to watch Gen Silent. It documents the various challenges that older gay people experience. And we should remember, however, that loneliness is not just something that happens to older people. As you might recall, I talked about the U-shaped curve of loneliness. The highest rates are among young people, and quite very young people and adolescents, and then older people, 70, 80 years and older. So it's not just a seniors issue. And this wonderful documentary from the BBC chronicles different cases of loneliness among different age groups. It's quite a good documentary. In addition to socio-demographic factors, loneliness is also linked to minority stress. So this is basically the stress experienced as a result of being a stigmatized minority. According to minority stress theory, rejection and discrimination can lead to concealment of your orientation, internalized homonegativity, sensitivity to rejection. And we know this has a negative impact on health, but also negative impact on your relationships. So if you're constantly concealing your sexual orientation, you don't come out to people, it's hard for them to know that you're gay, it's hard for you to meet people. If you feel ashamed of your sexual orientation, you might be less likely to certainly interact with other gay people and also to form a long-term relationship with them. If you're fearing constant rejection, that can put a strain and make it difficult to meet people. And if you do meet people, it can lead to the chronic anxiety that the person, your partner, for example, will reject you at some point. I should note that in addition to rejection and discrimination, I think just the mere feeling of being different can lead to some of these problems. So it's kind of like being tall. I mean, even to my knowledge, tall people don't experience a whole lot of discrimination, but they feel self-conscious because they're quite different, and I think that can lead to some of these social anxieties. This is don't be overwhelmed by this. This is a model based on data I collected from over 4,000 gay men around the world, and it just shows that there's a link between perceived marginalization and loneliness. And I wanted to see whether minority stress processes and social anxiety and social inhibition linked perceived discrimination and loneliness, and indeed it did. And the factor that seemed to have quite a strong impact was stigma preoccupation, so constantly thinking about, worrying about people accepting you as a gay person. What we also notice in the literature and probably in our own lives is that among some gay men, there's this incredible drive to be fabulous. And Alan Downs talks about this in his great book, The Velvet Rage. There's this drive to have the best education, the best career, the best partner, the best friends and clothes and vacations. And this might be due to what John Pachankis and Mark Hudson-Mueller have called the best little boy in the world phenomenon, which is essentially sort of an overcompensation for perceived inferiority. And it could also be due to attention seeking, because you may not have received attention when you were younger, or the attention that you received wasn't a good kind of attention. It could also be overcompensating for shyness. In any case, this desire to be the best can lead to perfectionism and rumination. So focusing excessively on failures or insufficiencies over and over because you feel you're a bad person if you have even the slightest flaw. Now, we can see how this would be related to loneliness. If you're always trying to be the best and come across as the best, it can lead to sort of haughtiness and then narcissism, which can turn people off, over competitiveness between men, a constant sense of people pleasing, which can lead to sort of inauthentic behavior, and a constant fear that whatever approval people are giving you can be withdrawn at any moment, the moment somebody discovers that you've done something wrong or that you are flawed, like most human beings are. We also have an issue within the community with formation of tribes and cliques. Not all, there are a lot of these cliques, but not all gay people find a place under the rainbow, and they may feel excluded from these various tribes and cliques. Why these are formed, I don't really know. It may be a sort of a self-protective defense mechanism. Stigmatized minorities are used to sort of turning inward to protect themselves, and this might generalize to within the gay community, and those who are fearing discrimination from others within the gay community may form their own groups and then exclude other people as a way to sort of protect themselves and also build self-esteem. And it may also be a way of turning the tables on others, doing to others what was once done to you. Whatever the reason, the consequences are negative. It leads to judgment of other gay people who don't fit into a particular tribe, leads to cattiness, a lot of cattiness. And this can, increase rejection sensitivity among those who are already at risk for this problem. And in addition, people who are catty tend to hang out with other people who are catty, and cattiness isn't exactly the best way to form positive, satisfying relationships, and can leave people feeling quite lonely. This is of no surprise. I'm sure focus on youth and beauty and masculinity is quite high in the gay male community. We see this reflected in the media. We certainly don't see many representations of older people. When we do have a representation of older people, it's usually a younger, older person, and it's like a silver fox, like Anderson Cooper. Those people who don't fit the mold can experience rejection, and this can certainly have a negative impact on self-esteem. In my research, I do see that there's a moderate correlation between self-rated physical attractiveness and loneliness. Although I should say, we don't know what the direction of causation is. It may very well be that lonely people might perceive themselves to be less attractive. I think there's probably some bi-directional relationship, but certainly this is an issue within the gay male community. I talked last month about unrealistic standards and expectations. Everyone is seeking a young and attractive partner, including other young and attractive people, which sort of leaves the majority of people searching for something that they probably won't be able to find, and this could lead to loneliness. There's also this, constant seeking for masculine partners, even though on average, gay bisexual men tend to be more feminine compared to heterosexual men. And then there's also this tendency to have a laundry list of prerequisites for partners, and this may be, again, an overcompensation. One may feel that the only partner who's acceptable is a partner who, meets this long list of criteria. That's the only kind of partner that would be considered socially acceptable. It may be because of a tendency to avoid intimacy, and it may also be a way of preemptively rejecting people, rejecting other people before they have a chance to actually reject you. And then also the expectation for perfect behavior from a partner. This may be due to lack of relationship experience, or because gay men hold themselves to a very high standard, and therefore they expect, they hold other people to extremely high standards as well. And this brings me to the role of technology and how it can exacerbate this tendency to look for perfection. Dating sites and hookup sites are very frequently used among gay men. It relieves the anxiety about determining who's gay or not. And also it's an easier way to meet people, and just generally less anxiety provoking. In my data, I find there's a small correlation between using Grindr and dating sites and feeling lonely. It's about 0.15. I didn't ask people how they use these sites, although I suspect that if I did, I would see that there's quite a strong relationship between misuse of these technologies and higher risk for loneliness. And one example of misuse is something that one researcher has called relation shopping. And online technologies give the illusion of abundant choice, and this leads to sort of catalog flipping mentality. When you're looking for a sex partner or romantic partner, it's like you're flipping through the Sears catalog, buying a microwave. I mean, when somebody doesn't meet all of one's criteria, they're ignored. And if a relationship does happen to form, a person can be dumped quite quickly at the first sign of a problem in a relationship. So rather than trying to fix the problem, they go back fishing for more people. And this can lead to loneliness because the person never stays long enough with somebody to form a deep, deep bond. These technologies can also lead to paradox of choice and fear of missing out. What research shows is the more choices you have, the less happy you are with whatever you choose, and the more you fear that you might have missed out on something better. These technologies can lead to disappointment. People often look for love on Grindr, and sometimes partly because these are marketed as tools for finding love, but then people feel disappointed when they realize that that's actually not what it's about. There are various effects in terms of appearance. Attractive people don't get as much attention as less attractive people don't get as much attention as attractive people. And this can add to rejection sensitivity that one already experiences. And the perception of others' attractiveness may also shift due to exposure to other attractive faces all lined up beside one another. These apps can facilitate using sex as a substitute for deeper connections. It can facilitate sexual variety. Men being men, they like sexual variety. These apps make it easier to find something new and shiny once you get bored with it. And it can also lead to all sorts of bad behavior. Attention seeking rather than trying to actually connect with people, blocking people who initiate conversation with you. Something even worse is ghosting, where you just stop talking to somebody after you've been talking to them for quite a while. And this can be quite devastating for people who are rejection sensitive because they ruminate and think over and over about what they may have said or done to have caused the apparent rejection. Name calling and also overt discrimination, which we see frequently. I won't read these descriptions, I'll just put them up here. There's also a problem with the misuse of social media like Facebook. As I mentioned last month, passive use of Facebook is associated with increased risk of loneliness. So doing things like just scrolling through photos and not interacting with people can lead to all sorts of problems. It can certainly lead to an atrophy of one's social skills. It can lead to excessive social comparison tendencies. So looking at other people's pictures of their happy social lives and comparing them to yours, not realizing that people carefully curate the things they put on Facebook. And this can lower self-esteem and increase your sense of being isolated from other people. Now, we talked about the 5 broad categories of strategies. Increasing the number of relationships tends not to work very well because what matters more is the quality of relationships. So I'm going to touch a little bit on these remaining 4 categories of strategies for preventing or reducing loneliness. And the first is improving the perceived quality of relationships. It's often easier to work with what you have already rather than seeking out new relationships. And so one thing that's been recommended is that people do an inventory of the relationships they already have. People are sometimes pleasantly surprised to realize they have more friends than they think they do. And by doing an inventory, they can sort of figure out which relationships they've let fall by the wayside and cultivate those relationships. And it's important for people to do this now while they can, because once you're older and you're not able to make friends, it's a lot more difficult to build your social network. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this may be harder for men for various reasons, and I think they need to be encouraged to be more proactive in this regard. And I'll skip this. Rethinking one's groups. I think it's important for people to create their own LGBT tribes and to be proud of them rather than trying to fit into pre-existing ones, and consider creating tribes that are based on meaningful interests and goals rather than physical appearance, and resisting the tendency to be exclusionary, and also looking to join groups beyond just the LGBT community because we are more than just our sexuality. Using social media with care, being clear about your goals. So when you're on an app or on a dating site, telling people what it is that you're looking for, but at the same time, keeping an open mind, because you never know when a casual fling might turn into a longer-term relationship. Having realistic expectations, so not having expectations that are not too high, but also not too low. People whose expectations are too low tend to behave in quite a passive way, and they don't use these technologies in a serious way. They don't really put much effort into it, and that can be counterproductive and certainly increase loneliness. Remembering not to take things personally. People online often know very little about you, and often all they know is what they see on a screen. You're a little blip on the screen. Avoid, as I mentioned, avoiding the passive use. So one example would be, you see a lot of people always wait for other people to approach them. Might be more productive for people to take a risk and try to approach people themselves. And importantly, remembering that there are people on the other end of the screen. So it's important to consider the impact of ghosting and how devastating that can be for people. And also expressing preferences in a respectful way. So saying something, if you prefer masculine men, saying something like, I prefer masculine men, rather than saying no femmes or flamers. I think better yet is not to say anything at all and just to avoid any interaction with people who don't meet your preferences. And importantly, seeing the value and meaning even in fleeting encounters like hookups. There's a great movie I watched a little while ago called Strapped, and it follows this hustler who follows him over one night. He has multiple sexual encounters with various customers, and we see how he learns something from each of his customers. He has a small epiphany. He learns something about himself or about other people. Another movie that's quite good is Weekend. This follows two gay men who meet at a bar and then spend the weekend together and learn quite a bit about themselves. None of these relationships become anything long-term, but they're quite important and quite meaningful in and of themselves. And I think people should remember these because these are the things they can turn to when they feel alone. These are the kinds of interactions that make you feel human and that remind you that at one point in time, even briefly, somebody did actually like you and did find you desirable. So I think it's important to cherish all sorts of interactions with people. Examining those unrealistic standards and expectations. Asking yourself, will a relationship solve all my problems? A person might long for a partner because they feel their life is boring or empty, but once they meet somebody, their life is still boring and empty. So, they realize loneliness doesn't solve all of their problems. Asking if you need a relationship to be happy. Many people are single and still manage to be happy. And many of the things that we think only others can provide, we can actually provide for ourselves to some extent. So entertainment, understanding, sympathy. We don't need others to do these things and to feel happy. Asking if you need a perfect partner and whether good enough is sufficient. I like something that Dan Savage calls the price of admission. He suggests that people should think about what's most important to them, seek out those qualities, and then remember that you might have to tolerate some minor annoyances or deficiencies in order to have what is most important for you. And that's what he calls the price of admission. Another question to ask is, can you afford to be picky? Does it make logical sense to expect that you can find a perfect person or somebody who even resembles that, given the very small pool of men from whom there is to choose? And also, ask yourself, do you want others to hold you to the same high standards that you hold other people? Challenging your thinking. So remembering how loneliness can affect perception and behavior, examining social misperceptions, asking yourself, looking at an interaction and asking yourself, is this really happening? Is this just something in my mind? Is this person nasty to me because they don't like me, or are they just having a bad day? Or the other explanations for the behavior, particularly neutral or ambiguous behavior. Examining maladaptive beliefs like an external locus of control. A lot of people feel relationships and friendships, partnerships are totally due to chance and to other factors outside of their control. That's not a very productive belief to have. Negative attitudes regarding aging, so feeling that aging is a time of inevitable social decline and that it's hard or impossible to make new friends in later life, which is certainly not true. And examining issues that may have caused loneliness in the first place, so the minority stress factors. And there's some GBQ affirmative cognitive behavioral therapy, which has been shown to be effective in reducing minority stress. It's been used for depression and social anxiety, but I think it may have a role in reducing loneliness. John Pachankis and Mark Hatzenbuehler write about it in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology for people who are interested in that. And there may also be a role for other therapies, including person-centered therapy and psychodynamic therapy, and really any kind of therapy that tries to create a warm, trusting relationship, which can help challenge a person's sense that others are not trusting and don't care for them. And of course, looking at pre-existing mental health problems, including clinical depression. So that's basically depression that has occurred really for no apparent reason, but is crippling a person and interfering with their daily life. I showed this last month. It's important to look at your cognition, but it's also important to look at and adjust your behavior. That's why we call it cognitive behavioral therapy. And John Cacioppo emphasizes that the way to ease your way out of loneliness is to extend yourself through small social interactions in safe places. These can subtly shift your social perceptions and make you feel more positive about people, and over time will encourage you to take greater risks. He strongly advocates having an action plan, having a plan of social activities, having a schedule, and forcing yourself to interact even when you really don't feel like it. Selecting appropriately, looking for the right people in the right places. When we're lonely, we often seek out any kind of human interaction, even if it's not the best for us, and that can leave us feeling even lonelier. So it's important to focus on the people that are going to mesh the best with you, and also expecting the best, because we know that when people are lonely, they do expect the worst. They become very negative about themselves and other people. Cultivating positive emotions. Again, focusing on and remembering the positive aspects of social interactions and even writing about them, taking pictures, saving cards and emails from people that you care about or who expressed kind regards. And this can be used for reminiscing. And we know from the research that reminiscence therapy can reduce feelings of loneliness. Also cultivating a sense of a personal achievement. Lonely people often feel like they have no sense of mastery, and it follows that if we can improve their sense of mastery, that might help reduce feelings of loneliness. One way of doing this is through life review, and in particular, structuring an instrumental narrative of your life. And that involves focusing on past experiences of overcoming hardships and demonstrating success in overcoming the hardships, and demonstrating mastery. And this can give people the confidence that they might also be able to overcome their loneliness. Unfortunately, with gay men, we often see an obsessive type of narrative where they focus excessively on all the bad things that have happened to them and how nothing good came out of those bad experiences. Also having meaningful goals for yourself rather than goals that are in the service of overcompensation and pleasing other people. And having meaningful hobbies, which not only helps you with, having meaningful hobbies can help people feel comfortable being alone and enjoy solitude. And I hear from a lot of people that they cannot spend even one moment alone because they're terrified of their thoughts. They're terrified that their demons will come and haunt them. But if they have hobbies that they really enjoy, that can make it easier to spend time alone. And that can reduce, increase the sense of mastery. It can help you meet other people. And importantly, when you spend more time alone, it can reduce the burden on other people. Because people who can't spend any time alone, who are always needing to be around other people, can be quite annoying and high maintenance. And that can put a strain on relationships and lead to loneliness for everyone involved. Quickly wanted to say something about boredom. Boredom and loneliness, not the same thing. Boredom could possibly lead to loneliness if somebody doesn't have sufficient social stimulation in their environment, or conversely, if they're boring themselves and people don't want to interact with them. People also have differences in the amount of social stimulation they need from other people. Some people they expect much, much more excitement from other people. And when they don't get that, they become bored and then dissatisfied with their relationships. They become over-reliant on other people. And some people are also just inattentive to social cues, so they're not really able to fully engage with other people and develop a deeper, satisfying relationship. Of course, loneliness can also lead to boredom. We know that lonely people find relationships less rewarding, and certainly as you withdraw socially, you're not interacting with people, that increases boredom. Accepting and tolerating some degree of loneliness, understanding why loneliness occurred, understanding how your experience contributed to it, accepting that it may continue. I think all these things can reduce the shame and self-blame and guilt associated with loneliness. And by accepting it, the research shows that people's relationships actually improve, perhaps because they become less burdensome and annoying to other people. And also tolerating loneliness through practices like mindfulness. And I love this quote from psychologist Carl Rogers. curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, lonely, for example, then I can finally change. There may be a role for religiosity and spirituality for those who are so inclined. Many people go to church not because they're religious, but because of the social element involved. Of course, this may be a challenge for older gay people who may have had a negative history with the church, but it is promising to see that the church is becoming more accepting of gay people. And helping others, which can be a form of distraction from your loneliness, can reduce self-focus, and we know that lonely people tend to be quite self-focused. Can lead to small positive social interactions which challenge your social perceptions, can increase your sense of self-efficacy, and provide a source of personal meaning. Helping other people cope with loneliness by teaching them about loneliness or trying to help them overcome can be a source of meaning in and of itself and make the loneliness seem like it's something somewhat positive rather than something horrible and something that's, made a waste of your life. And also reaching out beyond the LGBT community, because there's quite a big world out there. But I should say that volunteering and helping others, not a panacea for everything. We hear that volunteering is the solution to everything, but I don't think it is. And I have some concern sometimes that people take advantage of people who are lonely and depressed by encouraging them to volunteer more and more. So I think we need to be mindful of that. And finally, self-care, taking care of yourself. How would you treat a lonely child? Don't blame yourself. Remember what loneliness does to you. Although at the same time, remember that you also play some role in maintaining loneliness. If you cannot reduce loneliness, try to reduce its effects. Are there alternate ways to lift your mood? If you're depressed, perhaps it may be appropriate to consider medication. There's also some interesting speculative research about the use of medication to target loneliness directly. For example, increasing oxytocin, which can increase sense of trust and social well-being, and increase prosocial behavior, and also reduce social anxiety. And finally, keeping healthy in general, exercising, having a good diet, and trying to do whatever you can to improve your sleep. And finally, some cautionary notes. We cannot completely eliminate loneliness. It would be like trying to eliminate pain or hunger or thirst. We need those things to survive. This is often a private matter, and people are very reluctant to talk about this, even with their therapists. Because there's a lot of stigma. It's often due to long-standing problems, which are not going to be changed overnight. It can be difficult to change when chronic. We really need to have realistic goals for our lonely clients and realize there are no quick or easy solutions, no one-size-fits-all approach. And remember that, unfortunately, not all problems can be solved, such as life. I have some books, again, suggested reading. I showed these last week, but the new one here is Velvet Rage, which isn't about loneliness specifically, but it does allude to it. So it's quite a good read, and I'd recommend that. References can be found there. My email is there. And hopefully there's a few minutes for discussion.
Okay, so we'll start taking questions once again. So you can use the chat box, or if you'd prefer to call in, you can unmute pressing *6. But we just ask again that you use the raise hand feature so that we don't talk over each other. And for those of you who may have joined later, you can find the raise hand feature in the participants box at the bottom of the screen. So when you click it, it will say raise hand at the bottom. So that's where you can do it.
And if there are no questions, Dan and I have some questions we can pose to the audience.
Okay, I'm not seeing anything. I don't know if you want to jump in, Eddie.
Well, so I mentioned last month that I'm writing this constantly evolving report on strategies to reduce social isolation and loneliness among older adults. And I haven't really had much opportunity to talk to clinicians who may interact with lonely people and find out from them what suggestions they might have and what strategies they have used. I'm a researcher, I'm not a clinician, so I don't know. So I'm just wondering if anybody has any other strategies that they may have used with lonely clients. They could share them.
Okay, well, maybe people can
there's
choose.
one question here
Yeah.
in the chat box.
Yeah, so when talking about loneliness amongst GBMSM, how might it manifest differently in rural versus suburban locations, given the way that even online you see the same few people all the time?
As I mentioned, I'm speculating, I don't know. I think because I talked earlier about how loneliness can spread within social networks. And again, people ask how, and interesting studies on this. Again, when people are lonely, they behave in sort of an aversive way. And when you behave in an aversive way towards one person, they have a tendency that puts them in a bad mood, and then they behave that way towards other people. And I think in a smaller social setting, like a rural area, you would see loneliness spreading a lot more quickly. So that's one thought that comes to mind. I suspect, though, that in a way it can also be more positive in a rural environment because you don't have that illusion of endless choice, and you're sort of basically forced to choose among what's there. And even though you may not initially like the people in your network, and we know from the research that the more choices people have, the less happy they are with whatever they have. So I'll hazard to guess that in a rural area, people will lower their expectations a little more, and that can actually be beneficial. I do have data in my I do have data on rural compared to suburban and urban people in my data set, but I haven't looked at differences, or so far I haven't looked at them in detail. So far I don't see huge differences in loneliness.
Okay. So I'm not seeing any more questions, but maybe you could help me out with a question. So you mentioned boredom as being sort of distinct from loneliness. So how would somebody be able to differentiate between the two if you were talking to somebody? Like, how would you be able to identify that someone is experiencing boredom versus experiencing loneliness?
Where's this? I mean, certainly one. I mean, the quantitative way, being a researcher, I could certainly administer some kind of questionnaire that specifically evaluates for loneliness. Even just asking people directly, I mean, asking them, are they satisfied with their relationships? If they're not satisfied with their relationships, that's certainly a sign that they're lonely. And then probing to see if what may have caused the loneliness, whether boredom has caused it. I don't really know. I mean, it's very difficult to tease these things apart. I think other than like really sitting down with somebody and trying to understand what's happening in their life, I don't think there's some telltale sign. I don't know if you have any ideas.
No, I just found it was very interesting that distinction exists because I never really would have thought about making that distinction.
Well, I was at a conference a few weeks ago, and somebody had said, that loneliness is really just boredom. Like lonely people are just bored. And I kind of thought, well, no, that just, loneliness is loneliness, not being happy with your relationships. And boredom is just, you just don't feel stimulated in general. There can certainly be a relationship between them. I don't think they're the same thing. I think just what I said, I think boredom is more generalized. It's just a malaise about everything in your life, whereas loneliness is more specific about your relationships. Kind of like when I talked about depression last month, where depression is quite general, whereas loneliness is focused more specifically on the quality of your relationships. So I think focusing on the specificity of the different concepts, I think, is important. It's also, I'll have to one of those questions I'll have to think about for several days, and then I'll perhaps come up with a good answer. I don't know what else to say.
Oh, that's perfect. So we'll give people a chance to, again, give you a couple minutes maybe to see if anyone else has any other questions. Again, don't be afraid to chime in, even if it's not a question, but it's a general comment. Maybe this is something that you've seen a lot of in the work that you're doing. If you're working specifically with clients who express a lot of interest or a lot of issues with loneliness, like any interventions or strategies that you found helpful that you'd like to share with the call.
While we're waiting, I did want to mention one point that I really rushed through this because I thought I wouldn't have time, but regarding the cycle of chronic loneliness, I think one of the things that might prolong the cycle is this strange comfort that some lonely people may develop with their loneliness, even if it causes them intense pain. Kind of like a comfort that I've heard people with eating disorders express. They develop a sort of relationship with their eating disorder. It's like a friend almost, because it's so familiar. So the loneliness becomes kind of a companion, and people know what to expect from loneliness. They know it's very painful, but they know what to expect, and so they'd sometimes rather tolerate this predictable pain rather than the intense fear of actually reaching out and making a connection and doing something that is much less predictable. So I think that's something that I think we need to keep in mind as well. It's one of the reasons it can be really difficult to get people out of this cycle.
Oh, it looks like we have someone who's raised their hand. So whoever you are, feel free to *6 to unmute, and we'll wait for your comment. We can, appears that. Okay, it looks like we are waiting for them to respond, but I haven't heard anything yet. So,
I have another general question.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm just curious if people have found anything helpful in this webinar series. I've been giving a lot of these talks, and at the end of each talk, people always come up to me and they say it's all very interesting background information, but I really want strategies. I want things I can do for my clients. I suspect they also want things they can do for themselves, which is why they go to these presentations. And I always get this feeling that I haven't really given them what they're looking for. They kind of leave, I think they have expectations and they're not met. And I'm just not sure what those expectations are and what people are hoping for and what they hope to hear. And even reading the comments from Michael Hobbs' article, and people really liked the article, but a lot of them were just left wondering, okay, well, now what? This is interesting, but it's still not helpful enough. And I'm just wondering what more do people want? I'm curious what they may be looking for that I may be missing. Other than a magic wand.
So just a nice comment saying that they will review in detail and thank you for your presentation. And they think it will be very useful for non-LGBT people as well.
Oh, good. Another point that came to mind, that a lot of the factors that cause loneliness in gay people are the same as the ones that cause loneliness in straight people. And I think as gay people, we often perceive all of our problems through the lens of being a minority and through minority stress theory. And I think a lot of the reasons people are lonely just boil down to life. And I think it's important to focus on that and I think if you see everything through the lens of being a gay person, it just kind of reinforces this sense that, you know, things are hopeless and that there's something, you know, that you're fundamentally flawed because of your sexual orientation. I think a lot of loneliness and other problems are due to the same factors that affect everyone.
So someone is asking about just restating the connection between loneliness and depression.
So last month, I had a little chart from John Cacioppo's book Loneliness, which I recommend people read. And I compared and contrasted loneliness and depression. I think depression is more general. It reflects how you feel about life in general. And I wish I had the chart with me here. Loneliness is more specific. It reflects how you feel about your relationships, and it actually prompts you to reconnect with people, to get your social needs met. Whereas when you're depressed, you just kind of don't do anything at all. And the connection is certainly when you're depressed, you can feel lonely because when you're depressed, you become socially withdrawn. You don't go out, you don't talk to people. But the research shows, we have longitudinal research, and we look at bidirectional relationships, and the relationship, it seems more likely that what's happening is when a person is chronically lonely, they become depressed because over time, it just feels miserable to feel depressed. And I think what happens with some people is they just lose all energy altogether and they start giving up. And once that happens, you slip into a depressive phase. If it's severe, that's really maladaptive. Some people have argued that depression is actually adaptive because it prompts you to reevaluate a problem that you're having in your life. So some could argue that the depression that results from loneliness is actually a way of forcing you to look at your relationships. So there's complex bidirectional relationships, but overall, I think the stronger relationship is loneliness causes depression rather than the other way, rather than loneliness being merely a symptom of depression. If that makes sense.
And again, just to plug the YouTube page. So if you go on our YouTube page, you'll be able to find the first part of the series where he'll go into more detail of that.
There's a few more things in the box.
So I'll read this one. So in a small urban center that is mostly suburban, we encounter a lot of GBMSM who self-exclude from the community because they see themselves as, quote, not one of those gays. I can't say that this directly encourages them to be more lonely. What are your thoughts on this surrounding loneliness?
Well, certainly, I think if people can find other people that they connect with, that then they won't feel that lonely. But for people for whom it's important, for whatever reason, to be one of those gays, if they feel excluded from those groups, certainly that can increase the risk for loneliness. But if people are able to find other tribes, other groups to meet their needs, then I think that's great.
Okay. Do we have any other remaining questions? We are running a bit over time now.
There's another a question right before about, I don't know what Mortito is. I've heard of it, but I'm not sure what it is. So I'll look it up as soon as I hang up.
Okay. Well, I think that's everything. Okay, thank you so much, Eddie, and thank you for everyone on the call for attending and participating in our webinar. Again, this is recorded, so you will be able to see part 2 on our YouTube page when it's uploaded. So stay tuned for that, and thank you guys so much.